Welcome to Oglethorpe Day, and thank you all for being with us. It's hard to miss the battalion of yellow shirts in the audience. There are student athletes at Oglethorpe. Thank you, all of us. I'm honored today to have such a distinguished panel with us as we celebrate our 100th year on Peachtree Road. All of you have their bios in the program, so we're not going to, our time is short, we're not going to repeat their bios, but Beverly, Lisa, Doug, and Robert, thank you so much for joining us. You are all great leaders in this city and all good friends of Oglethorpe. I have to admit, when I began work at Oglethorpe a decade ago, I knew very little about our namesake, James Edward Oglethorpe, but I have learned some over time. At the age of 18, Oglethorpe entered college, like many of you today. He began college at Corpus Christi at Oxford, today our partner school in England. But when the Turks invaded Europe, he chose to leave school to serve in the military. 4 years later, he returned to school and to England, and he ran for the same seat in Parliament that his father had occupied for years. And he won. He was 26 years old. While serving his country, a friend of his was jailed for the non-payment of debt. At that time, the British prisons had held tens of thousands of debtors whose only crime was poverty. And his friend happened to be housed with another prisoner who had smallpox, and they both died in prison from the disease. And it was this event that motivated James Edward Oglethorpe to take up the cause of prison reform. And his work as a reformer led to the release of thousands and thousands of debtors from British jail. And he did this all before the age of 30. He recognized injustice, and most importantly, he did something about it. He acted. And he didn't stop there. His focus then turned to addressing the underlying causes of poverty. He came up with the idea that people thought was crazy at the time of transporting worthy poor people, that he called, from England to a new colony in America, an idea he believed would create the possibility of a utopian, classless society. The model of his new society, that came to be known as Georgia, was not for self, but for others. And there were three ground rules for New Georgia. No rum, no large estates, and especially no slaves. So in late 1732, a group of 114 pioneers set sail for America with Oglethorpe at the lead. They landed where the Savannah River met the ocean. If you've been to Savannah, you cannot miss the unique layout of that city. And it was not just a cute way to design a city. The design had a purpose. There were identically sized houses built on identical lots surrounding a series of public squares with restrictions on how much land any individual could own. This was to ensure that each settler had a plot of land that he worked himself. And no one could acquire so much land that it required others to work the land, others as in slaves. There was an outright prohibition of slavery in his colony, the only colony in Georgia across the world at the time that forbid slavery. He was a man of extraordinary vision and a man willing to act on his principles. I had the privilege of seeing Selma Sunday night. And as I sat there, thought that went through my head was that when the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. put out the call for people of all races to join him in Selma for the march to Montgomery in 1965, the young James Edward Oglethorpe would have answered that call and been at the front of the line. With that, let me introduce our own Dr. Kendra King Momon, Associate Professor of Politics and Director of the Rich Urban Leadership Program, who will moderate our conversation. Kendra.
Good afternoon, everyone, and panelists as well. We all know the work that you do in Atlanta, but we wanted to ask you if you'd share about yourself in the context of who you are in the city and the role that young people play in the work that you do.
Well, I'm happy to begin. I am the president of Spelman College, and of course that means the work that I do is focused on young people. Spelman College is here in the city. Of course, I think people know a historically black college for women, about 2,100 students, and many of our graduates continue to live in Atlanta after graduation. So it's, I like to say, the Spelman Nation in Atlanta is quite strong. I have, in addition, or maybe as part of the role that I play as a college president, just as President Schall does, I'm very involved in city activities of one kind or another. And some of those things have been focused on young people. For example, I led for a period of time a commission focused on early childhood education and thinking about how do we start young people off in such a positive way that they can inevitably be successful in colleges and universities and contribute to the Atlanta economy. So those are just a few ways that I would mention.
I'm Doug Shipman. I'm the CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is located right downtown next to the aquarium in Oglethorpe. And so in this city, in some ways, I'm one of the folks who thinks about the legacy of Atlanta, some of our most important legacies, but then tries to unlock those legacies for people who did not live through them. When we were designing the institution, which opened last June, we often talked about the 15-year-old and how we would engage the 15-year-old visitor who might not know more than "I have a dream" is a phrase that Dr. King said, and that's about it. And so I think that as an institution and as a person, I'm constantly trying to think about how can we bring this very powerful history to be a well that young people can pull from for their own social issues, whether they be domestic or international. I also get to move around the city in some ways. I'm very involved in my alma mater, Emory University, president of the Alumni Association, so trying to understand how alums can have an impact on the city. And I also think trying to think about how Atlanta can set an agenda for the nation. So we think a lot about the kinds of things we can convene at the center, or we can work with the King Center or with universities and colleges to convene certain conversations here, because Atlanta as well in many ways can serve as an incredible template for the conversation of contemporary issues.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Really? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you. It's great to be with you. I'm Lisa Borders, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Coca-Cola Foundation. I work with your board chair, Beverly, at the Coca-Cola Company, and we are of Atlanta, and our mission is to refresh the world. And we all know Atlanta is the center of the world, right? Yes. We got an airport that says so. You have to come through Atlanta to get to heaven, you know? I find myself at 57 years old recognizing what my passion is. I am a fixer. I have been trying to fix things my entire life, whether it was my siblings when I thought they were doing the wrong thing growing up, whether it was serving in public office when I was vice mayor of Atlanta, or whether today I have the privilege of trying to help fix and make the world a better place through our charitable arm with our team of colleagues across the globe. When I think about Coca-Cola and the power of the company, we are a Fortune 100 company in 207 countries. Our goal is to refresh the world in every sense of the word, from the commercial side of the business to the charitable side of the business. We believe in investing in communities because our company can only be as strong as the communities we serve. So we invest in education, and that's where we are today. You folks are in the business of education, right? Either you're giving it or receiving it. Help me, people. Right. Thank you. So we invest in education, and that is one of the primary ways that we help young people, but we recognize, too, they are the next generation of leaders, not only in Atlanta, but in the world. And so we want to make sure that we add back every bit that we take out. And so education is probably the primary way that we help young people, and we hope that our company helps young people, and by extension, the communities we serve.
My name is Robert Franklin, and I've had the privilege of serving as president of Morehouse College, where I was also an alumnus. So I came to Atlanta in 1971 as a freshman to attend Morehouse, and experienced Atlanta as a city slowly recovering from the 60s, slowly claiming its sons and daughters who helped to lead the movement to do what W.B. Du Bois called to rehabilitate democracy. So the likes of Martin Luther King and Coretta King, and so many other names that we could invoke, including Lisa's grandfather, who was a role model for me as I selected Morehouse as my college of choice. He was a graduate and a prominent pastor. And by the way, since President Schall mentioned the movie Spelman, Lisa can talk about this, but the inside sanctuary scenes in the movie were filmed in her church, in the Wheat Street Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue. So place that on your places to visit in Atlanta list as you see the film. After serving as president of Morehouse College, I'm now on the faculty at Emory University, a chair in moral leadership, and I define moral leaders as women and men who act with integrity and imagination to serve the common good while aspiring to make people better. And it seems to me James Edward Oglethorpe was one of the premier 18th, 19th century moral leaders of that time, his vision for Georgia as a colony. And we need moral leaders today. And I'm excited by colleges and universities of the city, the center downtown, that inspire and remind us of the importance of moral leaders. Effective leadership is great, but moral leadership is even more important if we are to build communities that are inclusive, that are fair and just, and that unleash the creativity and of every individual. So I'm thrilled to serve in that capacity now. And I also wear a hat at an institution. I'm directing the religion department at something called the Chautauqua Institute. Funny name, but it's worth Googling, because I want to invite all of you to come and spend part of your summer at this wonderful place in western New York, an hour south of Buffalo. And for 9 weeks every summer, 100,000 people converge on Chautauqua. Not all at once, about 10,000 per week. But extraordinary thought leaders, artists, musicians. It's kind of an Aspen Ideas Festival, but that's a very brief time. This is a 9-week season. And I'm pleased to bring kind of Atlanta energy and vision to that community.
Thank you all very much. What I wanted to do next, and we'll open it up to the panelists for you to respond. How would you say race intersects in the city of Atlanta? And in particular, for those of us who have either studied Atlanta or been born, we know the significance of where Peachtree meets Sweet Auburn. So in your life, how would you say you've seen race intersect in our city? Perhaps for good, perhaps in the lens of challenge. How are you going to respond to that? We welcome your thoughts.
I'd like to respond as an outsider, and by that I mean I moved to Atlanta 13 years ago. But I came to, so it's an interesting story I want to tell. I was born in Florida, Tallahassee, Florida, in 1954, so I just turned 60 years old in the fall. And 54 was an important year because, of course, it was the year of Brown versus Board of Education. And I always like to tell the story of my parents. My father was a college professor before retiring, and he taught in 1954 at Florida A&M, which is a historically black institution there. And he was educated at Howard University as an undergraduate, and my dad's an artist. He had an MFA from the University of Iowa, which I find interesting, thinking about, you know, Iowa in the early 50s. But then as a professor at Florida A&M, he wanted to earn a doctorate and could have done so at Florida State. He wanted to get a degree in art education. And Florida State had a program, but because it was 1954, and even though it was after Brown, he was not able to attend that institution because of segregation. The state of Florida accommodated the law, which was to desegregate, by providing him access to education in Pennsylvania. They paid his transportation to go to Penn State. So my dad got his degree, but he got it in Pennsylvania. And when he completed his education in 1958, my parents did not want to remain in Florida, and they moved to Massachusetts, which is where I grew up. So I say that to say that they were pretty much escaping the segregation of the South. That was very much their intention. I grew up, and he became the first African-American professor at the college where he taught throughout his career, which was Bridgewater State University. So when I got this job to come to be the president of Spelman, and I told my parents I was moving to Atlanta, they thought I'd lost my mind. You know, they were like, why you know, we left there. Why do you want to go back there? And of course, they did not have an understanding of the Atlanta of the 21st century, right? I came to Atlanta in 2002. And interestingly, now my parents have also relocated to Atlanta. You know, and they actually live up the street in Canterbury Court. But the fact of the matter is that idea of, you know, what is the new South and what is the Atlanta of today was very much a question mark that many of my friends in Massachusetts said, well, you know, what do you think about that, going to Atlanta? So, but what I see, and of course my experience in Atlanta has been very positive, and I intend to continue to live in Atlanta even beyond my tenure at Spelman. But that said, I do think you can see the legacy of segregation every day in terms of where people live and how the city's laid out and public education. And, you know, so there is certainly, it's a different community than in the days of Jim Crow, but you can still see the legacy of that. And I'm sure those who have been here a longer time than I have been can speak to that.
Well, let me speak then as an insider, having been here my entire life, because I like that framework. I grew up here in Atlanta, as Dr. Franklin said. My grandfather was a minister and had a very large church, Wheat Street Baptist Church, which is the one featured in Selma. When you see the opening scene of Selma, 4 little girls are walking down the stairs, and there are 2 stained glass windows on the left. That's my grandmother and my grandfather, on my father's side. On my mother's side, my grandfather was a chauffeur at the Coca-Cola Company from 1929 to 1959. So when you think about 1929, that was the year of the stock market crash, but my grandfather was able to get a good job, as my mother says. It fed the family and put her through school, through college, what was then Clark College. What I would say is that Atlanta is a very special place, but the vestiges of segregation are apparent every day. We've never had a race riot other than in 1906 in the city of Atlanta. Cooler heads have always prevailed. We might fight amongst ourselves, black, white, old, young, short, and tall. But if anyone else comes in and gets ready to punch us in the nose, we all stand together. You could see that at the Olympics when the committee bid for the Olympics for the 1996 event. I would tell you, unfortunately, the river of race runs through everything today, whether it's politics or business. When I think back to Dr. King winning the Nobel Prize, one of the most famous stories about that scenario was how when he came back to Atlanta, there was a group of people who wanted to put together a dinner to honor him. The city would not come together. Ultimately, though, cooler heads did prevail. Coca-Cola was a big piece of this and stepped in and said, we are going to honor this man. He has gotten one of the greatest honors in the world. What do we look like as a city not lifting him up and not supporting him? And so the story goes, everyone came together, the dinner was sold out, and everyone celebrated him much as we do today, and perhaps even more so because that was the first time it had happened. When I was growing up here on Auburn Avenue, because that's where my grandfather's church was, and that's where we spent almost every day, Professor, because you went to church almost this is the Bible Belt, remember? And I had a grandfather who was a preacher. I was asked, my family was asked to help integrate an independent school here. It's called the Westminster Schools. And we agreed to do that, and let me just say, people always say, why did you go to that school? I wasn't trying to integrate anything. I got a D in conduct in 6th grade for talking. Let's just be clear. And my mother said, you're going to end up under the jail. You need to be challenged, so we're going to send you to a very different school. That school set the tone for who I am today, in addition to my parents' upbringing, because it was a very adverse circumstance in 1969 when I started there. It was unique for Atlanta, but unique for the country. Brown versus Board of Education had happened, but we had not integrated fully in the city of Atlanta. In fact, the reason there is a separate school board from the city council, that was an effort to keep from integrating the city of Atlanta. That's a true story. So today, there are 2 different organizations, one running the city and one running the school system.
It is better today, but I agree completely with Dr. Tatum. The way the city is laid out, the way we live today, segregation is against the law. But we self-segregate by how we live, where we go to church, and how we behave. Some of it is human nature, I think, because it's sort of the birds of a feather. You're more comfortable with folks that look like you, work where you work. Dr. Tatum wrote a book about this, and I know she'll talk about it. But I think we are getting to a place, particularly with young people, who question that every day. Why are all the black people living in Southwest Atlanta or Northeast? Why do all the Hispanic people live here? Why does everybody go to this church? I think every revolution in history, and the presidents will correct me if I'm wrong, have started with young people and more open-minded thought about how things should be and where we should aspire to go, as opposed to us old people who are sort of, many of us with our feet in clay, who behave based on what we have experienced. So unfortunately, it's still present today, but I think we're making incremental progress on changing the dynamic in Atlanta and across the country.
To compound that, and Dr. Franklin, I want to get your feedback, and Doug as well. Adding to what you just shared, in what ways would you say education plays a role in all of this? Two things that Lisa said that resonated with me is, number one, when cooler heads prevail in our city, we see things happen. And then the second thing, I studied Dr. King and I studied nonviolence, and I know the importance of, number one, information gathering, but number two, the power of education. So how would you all share in terms of the role of education in progressing race relations?
Well, I understand that this ticket will purchase me a Coke float Sunday after the program.
Yes.
And I use this as a metaphor for what education does in this scenario. Education is a ticket, and it is a ticket to upward mobility, particularly within a very stratified society, where we're seeing increasing polarization between haves and have-nots. And so this is an issue that I think every one of us has to wrestle with as we make decisions in the future about where we choose to live, about where our children are educated, about where we purchase automobiles and durable goods, on and on. The private becomes public. The private becomes political. And education is a key ticket to upward mobility. And it cuts across this interesting landscape that you heard from President Tatum and Lisa Borders. And I think, for me, two statements come to mind as you asked the question, Kendra. The first was, race still matters significantly, but class may matter more. Some comedians joke about how black and white affluent classes in Atlanta are now carefully aligned against the poor.
Yes.
So there's a kind of unity that is something of a perverse spin-off on the point you were making about how Atlantans stick together. And I do love that about Atlanta. This notion of the Atlanta solution to solving problems is you do it over a Coke, and you do it in private space. And we work it out, we argue it out, and then we come before the cameras, and we have a kind of unified solution that somehow Chicago and Los Angeles and New York and Philly can't pull off. They just don't get that right. Atlanta does, and I think that is something to be proud of. So that's the point about the role of education, and race matters, but class may matter more. The other observations from a sociologist that looked at Atlanta and said, where you see the typical pattern of racial segregation in urban America is a donut hole. Central City is black and brown, surrounded by concentric circles of white suburbs. And those are donut hole cities. And most of America's largest cities conform to that pattern. But when they looked at Atlanta, they really shifted the paradigm and talked about a marble cake because of these varying patterns. And yes, there's a significant concentration of African Americans, working class and very affluent in Southwest Atlanta. My family resides there. These historic colleges, Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Atlanta universities in Southwest Atlanta, which unfortunately many white residents of Atlanta never see those campuses, never venture into Southwest Atlanta. So yes, there are these boundaries, they're psychic. But the point I'm making about this marble cake is that, to borrow a phrase from my study of Eastern philosophy, the notion of fixed and floating worlds, that there's this paradigm of there's fixed segregation, but there's floating, and the boundaries are more porous. And that's how I experience Atlanta. If you attach the adjective public to something, public transportation, public education, generally speaking, the public is increasingly more color-coded and under-resourced. So, you know, people don't want MARTA to come into Buckhead and other communities or beyond, in part because it has become a part of this public paradigm for poverty and black and brown presence. And so I think there's still some difficult issues like that we need to grapple with. And the moral leaders in this audience today are the people who are going to help bring solutions to this challenge.
You know, to extend on that, I remember a story Andy Young once told me. He said, at every major desegregation conversation that we would come together to try to solve, we already all knew one another. We, the civil rights leaders, we, the African American leaders, the college presidents, the business community, the white political establishment, the Jewish community, the business owners, there was already a relationship in place. It didn't have to be started at that table. And so what's interesting is, and I've had a personal experience, I'm white, if you can't tell. Some people can. And how many times, rather than nearest thousand, do you think that I've been asked, what is a white guy doing running the Center for Civil Liberties? A lot. What's interesting is that when I first started, I had 125 meetings with a lot of folks who were around the civil rights movement, and they all gave me what I call the civil rights quiz. They would ask me questions about Spelman, Montgomery, and Birmingham, and Atlanta, and I know a lot about civil rights history, in part because of Robert Franklin, who was an instructor of mine. And I would pass the civil rights test, and that education unlocked an intimate relationship very quickly that allowed us then to go about common conversation about what we wanted to do. And so I think education is not only what we think about kind of the intellectual side, you're going to get a degree, you're going to know these things, but it's also the big opportunity in Atlanta is to educate yourself about those other communities, is to actually know what's happening with the Muslim communities in Atlanta, to actually understand what is happening on the Buford Highway corridor, to be comfortable because you've educated yourself so that when you get to that space, you can develop a very quick, intimate relationship. The good thing about Atlanta is that we're willing to talk about race all day long. I mean, we will talk about race in all kinds of, I mean, look at the Hawks, Braves, I mean, all these things. We talk about race all the time. But I think what is the missing opportunity is no matter what you look like, if you take seriously the notion that I'm going to try to understand who you are and where you come from and how you fit, and I'm also going to understand myself, this town has a history of those relationships being able to go across race and across religion to do enormously important things. And so I would extend that notion of education to be not only what it is that you purchase, which I 100% agree with, but what is it that you watch? What is it that you consume as information sources? Are you developing a sophisticated palette so that as you move, you can be sophisticated around these issues?
Powerful responses indeed. And as we draw this conversation to a close, let me just say this. I've been petrified today because I looked up to all four of you from up close and afar. And so I just want to say thank you publicly for the opportunity to sit with you, glean. But as we close out today, the question always is, Atlanta's an international city. But we wonder what needs to be done to push us forward, in particular when we look at the emerging Latino population and their absence of voice, when we look at other communities that are rising up and their absence of voice. If we're truly going to be an alpha city, an international city, what closing thoughts would you give us in terms of what we need to do to truly become a standout 21st century city?
Well, I would submit that we have to make it an institutional and personal priority to include, to have seats at the table for those who are currently not present. And to the extent, since you identified this really growing, burgeoning Hispanic, Latina community in the state of Georgia and in Metro Atlanta, all of us have to work harder to ensure presence, voice, and visibility from the Latino community, none of us are doing very well there. And yet I see institutions taking the lead, and we're making some progress, so that's encouraging. But all of my colleagues have alluded to Atlanta's sort of global profile and presence. You know, that Coca-Cola sign is everywhere on the planet. Yes. But so is the legacy of President Jimmy Carter and the Carter Center. So is the CDC's bold and significant work and the achievements around helping to harness and suppress Ebola. So is the obvious legacy that we talked about of Martin Luther King and others who were alongside King. Many of them still alive, so whenever you have an opportunity to hear and interact with the Andy Youngs and the C.T. Vivians and some of those names we might mention, I hope that you will do so, because this is a place where it can happen. But America has a moral obligation to be a leader in the world. I see President Obama, whatever your politics are, on occasion, on his best days, really struggling to take that seriously and to place America as a leader, willing to be self-critical and to admit our shortcomings, which is a key element of moral leadership, that they are self-critical. But if you look at the most populous nations in the world, China, India, the United States is the third most populous country in the world, followed by Indonesia, Brazil, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Those are the top 7. And one doesn't generally hear from any of the other 6 powerful statements about a society working hard every day to include all of its members. And yet, leading the 3rd most populous, the 320 million Americans, is an African-American president. And I think that, in many respects, reflects that Atlanta approach to hopefulness, to taking diversity seriously and making it a policy and a priority in terms of budget and who we include at the table.
Let me say thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here with my esteemed colleagues on the stage and to be here with students and faculty and president and board members. I would say there are 3 things that we need to do to lead from Atlanta's perspective. We need to live our values. We have a legacy of inclusion. And if we really believe that, then we've got to pass the baton, this generation, to the next and help you understand why it's important for everybody to have equal opportunity, education, all the basic things that we need to live. That's number 1. Number 2, I think we have to reduce fear. I was taught that fear stands for false evidence appearing real. False evidence appearing real. So every time I hear someone say, I don't like this person or that person, I ask them, what are you afraid of? They have 2 eyes, 1 nose, a mouth, and 2 ears, just like you do. That's just another person. What are you afraid of? And then lastly, I would say we have to lift our individual and our collective voices when we see injustice or disenfranchisement. You cannot stand on the sidelines and not speak clearly and boldly, because there but for the grace of God, go you. So those are the 3 things that I would say we have to do to continue to be who we are and an even better beacon on the hill called Atlanta.
I would add 2. One is, I think we have to stop comparing ourselves to Charlotte and Birmingham, Tallahassee, and Chattanooga. I also did a little demography the other day. If you look at 6 million, roughly what Atlanta is, the global cities that are also 6 million are not Charlotte and Chattanooga and Tallahassee. They are Barcelona and Frankfurt and Buenos Aires and Toronto. I think we've got to think about ourselves that way, and we have to take those kinds of risks, and we need to get comfortable with playing at that level. Charlotte desperately wants to compare itself to us. That's the wrong metric. So first is, I think we've got to get our metrics straight, and I think that we've got to aspire in those ways on that global perspective. The other, and a little bit of a riff on what Lisa said, I think that each person has to say, how can I uniquely, given who I am and where I sit, open the door for somebody who doesn't look and think and come from the places that I come. That's what Atlanta has a legacy of doing, and that to me is what is very important. And it can be at the institutional level. It can be at the, I've got a panel and I'm going to make sure it's representative of certain voices. It can be at I've got an internship it can be in all kinds of different ways. But I think that each of us has a unique opportunity to open the door for somebody who's not like us. And if we're all doing that, then the whole system opens up. But it's so much easier to go on your LinkedIn, to see who's in your network, and it looks a lot like you. And not only just race and ethnicity, but religiously, class-wise, geographically. I mean, stretch yourself every day to say, hey, can I find somebody who may not otherwise have the chance unless I'm the one who opens that door for them. And then you see greater participation and you see greater access.
In some ways, what I want to say is a little bit repetitive, but I think about it in an acronym that I use often on our campus, and I want to use it here in this educational context. And it's what I call the ABCs. A, affirming identity, B, building community, and C, cultivating leadership. And I think A, affirming identity we've heard about, which is to say we want to make sure that everyone feels affirmed in who they are, and the best way to do that is to include, right? To ask the question, who's missing from this picture, and make sure that everyone can see themselves in it in a positive way. That's really what A is about, affirming identity. B, building community, is about bringing people from disparate points of view and creating space where people can indeed feel not only identified with their own particular group, whatever that group might be, but also with the larger collective. You know, we've just experienced an Oglethorpe tradition, running that quad, and that's something that every Oglethorpe member of the community feels connected to, presumably. And so we need those kinds of things that bring us together in a sense of shared community. But we also have to acknowledge that they don't happen that often. I don't mean that specific to Oglethorpe, I mean everywhere, where we can all say, oh, this is something that we all feel connected to. So the C, cultivating leadership, is really about creating opportunities to practice. Because you can't really lead in an inclusive way unless you practice that. And it's not something that you just naturally know how to do, coming from wherever home community you've come from. So I think we have to be very intentional, particularly in colleges and universities, in creating opportunities for students and faculty, all of us really, to develop our ability to lead in an inclusive way.
Would you all join us in giving our panel a round of applause?